Welcome to the debate. Today, we're dissecting a narrative that has really taken hold in New Zealand, a narrative captured in that Webfit news explainer. We don't need more Uber drivers. I mean, it's a sentiment we see amplified by some pretty inflammatory political rhetoric, specifically comments suggesting migrants in the gig economy are, well, evidence of a broken system, or worse, a burden that should be sent home.
It is a visceral topic, isn't it? It really cuts to the core of national identity. And we're looking at the report behind it all, the indispensability of migration, which it really pits hard fiscal data against the much messier social reality of infrastructure and integration. So the real question we're trying to get to is this: does the data prove that migration is the absolute foundation of our economy? Or is focusing only on that fiscal surplus masking these systemic failures in how we actually use human capital?
And I'll be arguing that the data is, well, it's unequivocal. The whole narrative that gig economy work equals low value is a destructive myth. The evidence we have suggests that migrants are the primary engine of New Zealand's fiscal health, and frankly, without them, the state as we know it is a structural impossibility.
And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. Look, I don't dispute the raw numbers, but I do argue that using them to paper over the cracks in the system is dangerous. That Uber driver phenomenon, it isn't a triumph of resilience, it's a clear symptom of what the report calls brain waste. We have to ask if importing high-skilled labor just to underutilize it is a success, or if it's a failure that raw GDP numbers just don't capture.
Okay, so let's start with those positions. As I was saying, my stance is grounded in the hard realities of the balance sheet. When you strip away the anecdotes, the political posturing, the fiscal data from Treasury and MBIE it's startlingly clear the migrant population contributes a net fiscal surplus of $3,288 million. Now compare that to the $2,838 million from the New Zealand-born population.
Right, the aggregate numbers are certainly large, but large numbers can hide a lot.
They can, but it's the per capita gap that truly dismantles this burden narrative. A single migrant contributes, on average, a net fiscal impact of $3,547. A New Zealand-born citizen, just $915. That is a nearly fourfold difference. We're looking at a group that often arrives in their peak working years. They require less state investment in early education, and they immediately contribute to the tax base. My argument is that New Zealand's very existence as a modern first world state is structurally impossible without this input. The Uber driver narrative, it just falsely equates a person's current, often transitional job with their actual skill and their real economic value. These aren't unskilled workers. They are resilient professionals who are, in effect, subsidizing the state.
I see why you're emphasizing the balance sheet, and look, those numbers are irrefutable as far as tax revenue goes. My definition of a successful migration system is just different. My position is based on that concept of brain waste that the Webfit news source material highlights. I mean, if we have a system where an immigrant doctor is driving a rideshare car, that's not an economic triumph. That is a systemic failure.
But they're working. They're contributing. They aren't on the dole.
They are working, yes, but at what efficiency? My argument is that importing all this human capital without the capacity to actually use it, through licensing bottlenecks, for example, or the capacity to house them, it creates a friction you can't just dismiss by pointing to a tax surplus. The report mentions a zero migration model that predicts catastrophe, which, okay, I acknowledge. But relying on that extreme scenario shuts down the necessary conversation about sustainable levels. We have to look at the misalignment between policy and reality. If we're inviting engineers and doctors, but then forcing them into low-skill roles, we're exploiting their labor, not integrating their skills. We're creating a functioning economy on paper, but a dysfunctional reality for the people living it.
Let's move into the core debate then, because I think you're touching on that specific Uber driver myth that Webfit News deconstructed. You call it a tragedy of brain waste. I call it a triumph of character. The 2024 migrant survey report that's cited in our material, it shows high life satisfaction among these groups, despite those skill mismatches.
Satisfaction is a very relative term, isn't it? I mean, satisfaction compared to what?
a war zone, economic collapse back home. That feels like a pretty low bar for a developed nation.
Compared to the alternative of dependency, we are talking about a demographic that just refuses to be a burden. The data shows migrants have significantly lower rates of welfare dependency than the native-born population. When a politician talks about sending people home or mocks gig workers, he's mocking people who have, the courage of their convictions.
Right. Let's dig into that specific example, though. The doctor driving an Uber. Because this is where the triumph of character argument, for me, starts to fall apart.
Okay, let's take the medical sector. We know 40% of our registered doctors are trained overseas. But for those trying to get in, they face a massive barrier. You've got the NCRX exam, the New Zealand registration examination, which cost about $10,000. And then there are these severe bottlenecks for the first-year PG1 spots. That's postgraduate year one, the supervised practice you need to get licensed. If an individual chooses to drive an Uber to fund that $10,000 exam instead of going on a benefit, that is the very definition of the healthy immigrant effect. They are prioritizing their financial independence.
I am not questioning their character. I think we agree the bludger narrative, the lazy immigrant, is factually wrong. My issue is with the system that demands that kind of courage in the first place. You mentioned the PGY1 bottleneck. That's exactly the point I want to press. The Webfit source explicitly quotes a study on the misalignment between policy and reality.
Misalignment happens in every economy.
But this feels like a specific, almost engineered misalignment. If we have a shortage of doctors, which we absolutely do, with patients facing record wait times, and we have qualified doctors driving cars because they can't get a supervised placement, that's an inefficiency that costs the country far, far more than the tax revenue from their Uber driving. You're praising them for swimming upstream, but I'm asking why we haven't just built a bridge.
It is an inefficiency, I'll grant you that. But is it an argument against them being here?
It's an argument against the strategy of them being here. It questions the ethics of the whole system. Continuing to import high-skilled labor into a market that then blocks them from working in their field feels unethical. It creates this class of worker whose human capital is just eroding over time. Skills atrophy. You mentioned the healthy immigrant effect, but how sustainable is that if they're trapped in low-wage cycles for 5 or 10 years? The data shows 23% of migrants whose jobs don't match their skills say they are overqualified. That is a massive reservoir of lost productivity. We are burning jet fuel in a lawnmower.
I'd argue that burning jet fuel in a lawnmower is still better than having no fuel at all, which is what the zero migration data suggests. The Webfit source says its role isn't to take sides, but to provide context. And the context here isn't just about right now. I want to bring in the historical perspective because the report draws a direct line to the Vogel era of the 1870s.
Ah, the great infrastructure boom. Sir Julius Vogel.
Exactly. In the 1870s, the population didn't just grow, it tripled from 171,000 to 470,000, specifically to build rail, ports, bridges. The report makes it clear. New Zealand has never been a project of internal isolation. Just like in the 19th century or the post-war Dutch and Pacific waves, modern infrastructure projects require imported labor. And the Department of Labor's zero-sum analysis is, well, it's terrifying. Ending migration would drop GDP by 11.3% and slash the labor force by 10.9%. We physically cannot build the housing you say is lacking without the very people someone to send home.
I have to challenge that historical comparison, though. It's compelling rhetoric, but there's a critical difference. The Vogel era was debt-driven, yes, but it was focused on building the infrastructure for the people who were arriving. It was a build-it-and-they-will-come model. The current debate, and Webfit News acknowledges this, is about pressure on housing and an infrastructure lag that already exists.
But the labor is needed to fix that lag.
But the timing is off. In the 1870s, they built the tracks. Today, we're just adding more passengers to a train that's already standing room only. We're importing people to build houses, but those people also need houses, which drives up demand, which means we need more builders, who also need houses.
But if you stop adding passengers, the train company goes bankrupt. That's the GDP drop. That 11.3% drop isn't just a number. That's a depression. That's austerity, hospital closures, slashed pensions.
Sure, a GDP increase helps the state's balance sheet, but does it help the individual if congestion doubles and housing costs go through the roof? This is where the aggregate data can hide the lived reality. A fiscal surplus of over $3 billion is wonderful for the Treasury. But if that surplus is just swallowed by housing inflation caused by rapid population growth, then the average citizen, migrant or NZ-born, feels poorer. The fiscal surplus might just be the cost of catching up with the growth we just induced. It's a circular economy of chasing our own tail.
I think that view assumes a zero-sum game on housing, which the report disputes. But let's look at who was actually keeping the lights on. The report highlights that migrants are concentrated in essential sectors, 21% of the healthcare workforce, 13% of construction. If we pause migration to catch up, who builds the houses? Who staffs the hospitals for our aging population?
You're pivoting to the dependency ratio.
Because it's the ticking time bomb in the room. The brain drain data is critical here. In 2024, we had a net loss of 55,300 citizens. Kiwis are leaving. They're going to Australia, the UK. Migrants are the only thing preventing a total collapse of the high-skill labor market. If we don't import that labor, who pays for superannuation for the retiring boomers?
That is a fair point on the labor force composition. The construction dependency is real, but this brings us to the social dimension. You mentioned the aging population. The report projects that by 2048, Asian ethnicities will make up 33% of the population. I mean, that is a massive demographic shift.
It is, and it makes Shane Jones's rhetoric about sending the Mexicans home, bizarre geography aside, pragmatically suicidal. The report says that as the European share of the population declines, relying on marginalizing growing communities is just a failing strategy. These communities are the future tax base.
I agree that xenophagia is unacceptable, but the Webfit script explicitly calls to acknowledge legitimate public concerns, and dismissing all concerns about rapid demographic shifts as racism ignores the need for social integration. When you have high migration combined with the brain waste we've been talking about, you risk creating a stratified society.
Stratified how?
Well, if you have a class of highly educated migrants working in service roles because of licensing failures, PhD students delivering Uber Eats, and a native population feeling squeezed by housing costs, that's a recipe for social friction. It creates a visible hierarchy. The focus needs to shift from, do we need them? The answer is obviously yes, to how do we integrate their skills? The current system is failing at that integration. The social cohesion mentioned in the report, that high trust among migrants, that's a resource we're squandering. If we keep treating them as fiscal batteries to be drained, that trust will erode.
I think fiscal battery is a cynical metaphor, though I do understand the concern. But the data shows they are integrating, often better than the native-born. Higher trust in institutions, higher employment rates. The friction seems to be coming from the political rhetoric, not the communities themselves. The report notes that trust is particularly strong among Asian people and recent migrants. They are bringing a social capital that stabilizes the country. The danger isn't the migrants, it's the politicians who use them.
The resilience of migrants is commendable, absolutely. But relying on their resilience to overcome systemic barriers is just bad policy. You can't build a nation's future on the assumption that new arrivals will happily endure underemployment forever. Eventually, they'll leave or they'll stop coming. And given the global competition for talent, can New Zealand really afford that?
We certainly cannot, which is why the Uber driver narrative is so dangerous. It signals to the world that we don't value that talent. But I want to circle back to the central thesis of the source material, indispensability. The report concludes New Zealand is a nation built by the hard work of immigrants. It's not just an economic calculation, it's a historical identity.
It's an identity, but it's an identity in flux. The source asks, is the issue migration levels or how we integrate skills? That's the pivot point. You see the levels as the solution to the economic problem. I see the lack of integration as the cause of the social problem.
But you can't integrate people who aren't here. And if you cut the levels, you cut the resources needed to fund that integration. It's the $3.2 billion surplus that pays for the schools and hospitals. You can't separate the fiscal engine from the social outcome.
You can, however, tune the engine. A smaller, highly integrated intake where every doctor practices medicine might generate a smaller gross surplus, but a higher per capita well-being and less infrastructure strain. That's the nuance that the zero migration versus open doors binary misses. The Webfit report mentions that earlier migrants, those here over 15 years, had the highest fiscal impact, over $4,000 per head. That proves that settlement is where the value is, not just arrival. We're good at arrival, we're mediocre at settlement.
I would argue that data proves the system works over time. They arrive, they struggle, maybe driving Ubers, they adapt, and eventually they thrive. It's a proven pathway. The Uber driver phase is a stepping stone, not a destination. It's the entry fee they're willing to pay, and we benefit from it.
For some, it's a stepping stone. For others, it's a trap. And for the country, it's a massive opportunity cost. Every year, a surgeon drives a taxi is a year of surgeries not performed. That loss isn't on the Treasury's spreadsheet, but it is on the waiting list at Middlemore Hospital. We are so focused on the cash they bring in while ignoring the value they fail to generate because we've handcuffed them.
And that brings us to our closing thoughts. We've covered the fiscal dominance of the migrant population, the myth of the unskilled worker, and the infrastructure challenges. As the Webfit news source says, this is about encouraging respectful discussion, and we invite viewers to engage with the facts.
Indeed. And looking at all the evidence, my conclusion is this. The fiscal data is irrefutable, but it's also insufficient. You can't run a society on a spreadsheet. The lived reality of brain waste suggests our current system is exploiting the resilience of migrants rather than empowering them. We have to separate worker value from work type, as the report says. But we also have to demand a system where a doctor can be a doctor. The Uber driver narrative is a tragedy because it highlights our failure to unlock the potential we've invited to our shores. We need to move beyond counting heads to making heads count.
That's a compelling framing, though I still maintain that the Uber driver myth is primarily a political distraction. The truth is that New Zealand is fiscally and structurally dependent on migration. The data confirms migrants are the primary source of the state's surplus and the backbone of our essential services. If we listen to the nativist rhetoric, we cut our own economic throat. I reject the idea that gratitude is owed to migrants. If anything, an apology is owed to them for the systemic barriers and toxic rhetoric they face. The Uber driver isn't a symbol of failure. They are a symbol of the courage of convictions that keeps this country solvent.
So it seems we agree on the value of the people, but disagree on the health of the system they're entering.
A fair assessment. The Webfit news prompt leaves us with that final question. Is the issue migration levels or how we integrate skills?
And perhaps, why do we accept brain waste as a normal cost of doing business?
These are questions the data can inform, but only society can answer. Thank you for joining the debate.